Our very simple database contains two users of our application who could potentially log in. What we need to find is a way in which we can search this database, text file, and look for the right one, so that when a person enters something in the username box of our application, we search for that username in the list, and having established that the username exists, we then check that the corresponding password that they have supplied that matches what we've got stored in our database. This is not the way you would do it in real life. This is so insecure that it is absolutely not recommended at all. Having said that, what it does do is demonstrate the principle of what happens. We go from an application to an external data source and search it for the things that we need to use. So when we do our search and we want to get our data checked, validated, we're going to call it in this case, we've got to make sure that we can return true. And if there isn't something that's true, we can return something that's false, so that we can give an appropriate message back to the end user saying you're validated or your credentials are incorrect. So that's what we're going to do. And we're going to set up a class to manage this data. So let's create our class as usual in the project, not in the solution. Right click and you'll get the add menu, the sub menu, and then sub menu again, which says class. Now obviously we need to give this a meaningful name, and what I do as a scheme, as my protocol, as my rules if you wish, I want to be able to identify what the purpose of these classes may be by simply looking at their name. So I'm going to call this one user DB. Now user DB is a meaningful name for me. We're dealing with the users. We've got a DB, which means that it's going to handle data. So I create my class as usual, and of course the first thing we're going to do is make it public. Excuse me. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to put in my usual commentary, which I've actually got on my clipboard. So class user DB created by, now what I haven't done is put a description of it, and I deliberately didn't do that because I want to discuss that first. What our class is designed to do is one of the four things that we always do with databases. We do CRUD with data. You'll remember that from our discussions before. And what we're doing with this is the R. We're going to read the data. But this class could be the focus point where you put all of those four operations into practice. So we set up this as if we're going to do everything, although we're only going to do one. So we set it up with a name that says DB. And we could implement all four of our CRUD operations in here, but at the moment, as I say, we're only going to do the read, the R. So let's put a comment in that represents that. So I'm going to put this in here, setting up the CRUD operations for the text database, but we're only going to do one. But don't worry, we'll comment that as we go along, and then you might want to try it yourself to make a feature that we used last year. Remember when we added things to the text files, you might be able to do the C, yeah, and make a new user. That might be a really cool thing to do. You know, but on your home page, you set up a register button, whatever it might be, or a create account, whatever you want to call it, and do a C that it goes into the text file in the way that we did it last year. You may notice that I've added the word purpose in front of that comment. I think if we keep this style, it might be actually very good. I'm trying to work out in Visual Studio, and I can't remember how to do it. There's a way in which you can set up what's called sort of template text and code snippets. And you can press a special key set to put in the class. And we could say class author, we might supply some of the default information and leave maybe the class name and the purpose empty, so that you just have to type those in when you create a new class. But I can't remember how to do it. And it's actually not that important for us, is it? So what we're going to do is we're going to create a function inside here, inside the class, which is going to be called validate user. Now I've got the signature on my clipboard. So there's the signature of our function. So we've got a public, absolutely, we need to use it in other parts of the application. Static. Now that means that we can use the files, the class's methods without having to create a new instance of that class. What that means is that if we want to go to validate a user, we can just do user db.validate user. If we didn't have a static class, we could create a new instance of UserDB and then go on to do the validation as a separate operation. This cuts out one step. The name of the method, it returns a bool, that's true or false, and the name of the method is validate user, and the parameter that it needs, the argument that it's going to be given, is a user, and we've got that as a public class here, so we can supply it as an argument here, and we're going to call that function, that parameter user to validate. So that's very straightforward. So we obviously do that, and what I would normally do is I would fill in this code bit by bit, but I'm going to do clipboard only, and I'm going to copy it in a moment so that we can just walk through it, because I think that's the way to do it, is to save you watching me type so badly. So in our function, in our method, it's going to return a bool. Now, best practice is not just directly return the bool straight into the function signature, but to use a variable that tracks it as we go. So if I do that, tracking value variable, and if I now just paste it in, because I've got it on my clipboard, we're going to say that the bool that we're going to return is validated. That's the name of it. Is the user validated or not? And what I often do to stop this red line is immediately return validated. So our validated, whatever is going to be returned by this method, is the current value of validated, and it will be true or false. So what we'll do now is we'll start to build up the rest of the operation that we're going to carry out inside this method. So the first thing we're going to do is underneath here, we've started up that, and we're going to say, we're going to define where our database is. And that's actually on my D drive. My user database is on my D drive. So that's where it's going to be found. In your case, it may be on your C drive, and I urge you to put it as close to the root drive, your main root of a drive, as you can, because path names get long, you make mistakes. The longer they are, the more likely you are to make a mistake. So that's that setup. String user database is that, and that @ removes the need to define these separator characters separately and using escape characters. It's a really useful way of getting a nice string formatted as we wish. So what we'll do next is we define our data table that we're going to use to hold the data that we're going to analyze, and this will immediately represent a problem. So it says in my thing that this is not defined, and in my version of the Visual Studio that I'm using, it comes up with, are you missing a reference? So it's put it in for me. See up there, using system.data. We're now allowed to use the type called a data table. Now we're using the type data table. I'm going to call mine user data equals new data table. So we've now got an instance called user data that we can work with. So we're going to use our import data class to allow us to get the data from our text file. So back in here, so create the data table. User data that we just defined here is going to be given all the values from import data, get to text file data, user database, which is here. So that's how it gets the data from one place into here. So the data which was in a separate text file in an external database is now available for use inside our application. That's a real world type of strategies for handling data that comes from somewhere else other than inside the application. So the final bit we add in is this. Now this is a bit more complicated, of course. This is us looping through everything that's in our data table called user data, and we're going to use a for each. Now for each does all of the 4 things that we need to do, but you don't have to put limiters. It just goes through, oh, I'm finished now, there aren't any more, and it stops. You don't have to define a control variable. It just goes through each one of the items in a list, a collection, and in our case in this data table. So let's go through it. So we're saying the var current user is a new user. Okay. So for each row, we're going to say the username is that and that, and if the current username is equal to the user to validate that we've passed in, we'll then check if the password is correct, and if it is, it's true. And we drop out. That word break allows us to drop out at that execution point. Let's go through it again. We're going to loop through the data row, and the current user is a new user. We have to do that every time we check a row. And the current user's username is that, and password is that. The row.field string, you've seen this before from last year. And then we will say if current user, whatever we've assigned from the text file, that row of data, if the username is equal to the user to validate username, which is the one we passed in, then if, that's a nested if, you can see, then if the password's correct, it's true. If this one here was correct, but this one was false, it would return validated equals false, or validated wouldn't be changed, in fact, because we initially set it up as being false to stop false positives. We assume false and then change it if its state changes. So that's our validate user functions. Let's just build to make sure there are no gross errors. And the build has succeeded. So that's really good. So let's just tidy up a little bit here, taking out some blank rows perhaps. And that looks a bit neater. So that's really good. So the last thing we're going to do is up here, I'm going to put the 3 slashes, and it's picked up the summary. So that's validation for the app. So that's now got us a nice, it's got the parameter name user to validate, and that's really what we want, and that's really good.